it's incredible, Anne-Marie, to think about this, that the last U.S. president to visit Cuba was Calvin Coolidge.
I know.
88 years ago.
Yeah.
And this is, I mean, I don't think for a lot of people this has sunk in how historic of a moment this is for a United States president to be there in Cuba.
And though the first family arrived yesterday, this is actually his first greeting with Raul Castro. And, you know, some have questioned why the president of Cuba didn't meet him as he came off of the plane yesterday. But they're there now. There's going to be an official photo taken and a handshake. And then the two will eventually meet. And I'm sure there are a number of things to talk about. Of course, this is significant because we're looking at the continued thawing of relations between the United States and Cuba. And it's only a 3-day trip, but the president is packing a lot in. You know what I found very curious, though? We're seeing a lot of dignitaries. We're seeing politicians. We're not seeing sort of the crowds that you might expect to see. I know he's not the Pope, but you remember when the Pope arrived,
right.
There were crowds everywhere. And I wonder just how the Cuban government is dealing with this visit and
right.
why we're not seeing those crowds.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. There were some people that were earlier taken away. They were protesting, and so that is the issue that a lot of people have struggled with, not just in Cuba, but here in the United States. The Castro regime was a brutal, repressive regime, ultimately imprisoning thousands of people who were just trying to express their God-given right to freedom. But this is yet still a historic moment, and you know the question that a lot of people are going to have is going to be put to President Obama at some point, because after he has this meeting with Raul Castro, he will, along with the president of Cuba, deliver statements to the press. And so it'll be interesting to hear. That'll come this afternoon. It'll be interesting to hear what they have to say. Let's go ahead and listen into a little bit of this ceremony.
está formada. Jefe de la Guardia, Teniente Coronel Peraza López.
You know Mr. Rose. Press secretary. Nice to meet you, sir. Just have experts in all things Latin America. These are the two that actually do the work.
Estas son las dos personas que trabajan y nosotros llevamos los laureles.
Yeah. Very nice to see you. Would you look up? Okay. Very nice to see you, sir. Thank you so much. Good to see you again. Thank you. Appreciate you, sir. Good to see you. Thank you.
Minister of Agriculture,
Very nice to see you. Thank you.
head of the Cuban
Good to see you again. So nice to see you again.
Minister of Foreign Affairs,
Good to see you again, Ambassador. Mr. President, good to see you again. So nice to see you.
Deputy Director of
Thank you.
Vamos, brother.
A la banda.
Because I know they don't get a chance to practice our national anthem at all.
All right, President Obama going through a receiving line. I could hear, if you as well as our audience could hear, the president being introduced to various dignitaries in Cuba and now shaking the hands of those military band members there. And he is, of course, with Raul Castro, the president of Cuba, the sitting president of Cuba. Again, this is, whilst we look at these historic pictures coming to us live from Cuba, we can't forget that many people have questions about how this relationship will proceed in the future. This is a country that Human Rights Watch, for example, has said engages routinely in torture, imprisonment of dissidents, unfair trials, extrajudicial executions. That is something that this government has been accused of. The president, though, hoping that by opening up Cuba, which has been under this blockade, under this since 1958, when Fidel Castro took over, the United States has not had normal relationships with this country. It will be interesting to see if some of those things are addressed when the president sits down with Castro.
This is a video just moments ago of Raul Castro and the president officially shaking hands, the official greeting. But you're right, Vlad. This is part of an ongoing thawing of relations between the two countries, and there was a deal hammered out. It included many things: opening an embassy in Havana, more diplomatic relations, the opportunity for American businesses to flourish, or to at least open up in Cuba. And we're hearing now about how Starwood, which is a chain that runs several hotels, they've hammered out a deal with the Cuban government to at least manage some hotels. all things related to commerce, diplomatic relations, but the key criticism is that none of them were contingent on the Cuban government, moving away from communism, moving towards democracy. But of course, President Obama and those in favor of the deal argue that, listen, more diplomatic relations means that maybe we can open up a pathway to communication, and in that way we can change things.
And it's interesting to look back at the history of Cuba. I mean, this is a country that fought very, very hard for its independence, which ultimately it won in 1898 from Spain. And when you think about this, there's also a mistrust on the Cuban side, because up until the Cuban Revolution, when Fidel Castro seized power in 1958, thereby sending the then president Fulgencio Batista into exile, the United States had treated Cuba as almost a colony of its own and treated the Cuban people as some type of colonials. There were hotels, there were business interests on the island that did not benefit the Cuban people. And that was ultimately what sparked the Cuban Revolution. And so that distrust has remained. And Cuba has defined itself through the prism of its relationship with the United States. And so whilst we talk about the repressive regime that Fidel Castro ultimately ushered in, it's interesting to note that our hands are not unsullied when it comes to the relationship that we had with Cuba in the early part of the 20th century.
This is certainly the sort of thing that President Obama, I'm sure, is hoping will help to define his legacy as a president. A little later on today, he's actually going to be meeting with some small business people. I think Margaret Brennan called it a beer summit.
That's right. There's going to be a beer summit happening.
Right.
We've actually got our CBS reporter, Portia Siegelbaum, on the phone with us. Portia, we're watching images now of President Obama with Raul Castro, this very historic visit, first president in 88 years. I think we lost Portia. She's I'm guessing the phone network isn't as developed as it probably will ultimately end up being at some point. Even if you're using a cell phone, it is probably not as easy as it might be in some other places. We're also hoping to be joined by Margaret Brennan, our State Department correspondent, who's actually traveling with the president in Cuba. She's going to join us shortly to break this down. But as we were saying, this relationship with the United States and Cuba, which has been ongoing for so many years, it's intertwined. But there has been distrust, both on the Cubans and on the United States. Clearly, the United States hoping that by allowing this economic opportunity to occur will hopefully dial back some of those issues, those human rights abuses that we talked about, that the Castros have been perpetrating on the Cuban people for so long.
We are going to keep tabs on what's happening with the president in Cuba, but for now we're going to take a bit of a break and then bring you up to speed afterwards.